Okay, hello everyone. This is Gregory Peek for the Joe Anthony Project. Today is June 23rd, 2021. It's approximately 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where I currently am in central Pennsylvania. And today I have the good fortune of speaking with Mr. Robert Chavez. How are you doing today, sir?
Oh, I'm doing fine.
Great, good to hear that. And thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I just want to say as a note to the transcriber listening to this audio that we're still sort of living through the great coronavirus pandemic, but things are on the improvement, at least here in the United States. There's multiple vaccines circulating. A good percentage of the adult population has gotten vaccinated, and now they're moving on towards trying to vaccinate younger people. So hopefully things will continue to improve, and I'll be able to conclude my remarks about the pandemic in subsequent interviews. So I've just been sort of giving a running tally of how the pandemic's been going as I've been conducting these interviews. All right, so like I said, today I have the good fortune of speaking with Mr. Robert Chavez. What I have everybody do, Rob, is for the first question, just give a brief introduction. Consider somebody listening to this interview from the future, somebody who doesn't know you personally or know your work. How would you like to introduce yourself to them?
Sure. My name is Robert Chavez. I'm a native San Antonian. Lived here my entire life, and throughout that time, I've always been an avid heavy metal fan. I am formally educated. Have a bachelor's degree from Baylor University, and have completed an MBA from Our Lady of the Lake, and I just recently finished my MED at UTSA. Back in 1996, I began a video cable show called Rob's Metalworks on Time Warner Cable, and we were distributed throughout the city on Time Warner Cable. It reached about 400,000 homes, and initially we focused primarily on local heavy metal acts, videotaping bands, and then gradually began interviewing bands. And throughout the first, I want to say maybe the first 7 years of our program, we never aired a rerun in 7 years. And our program ran weekly. I was very proud of that. It was a marketing strategy, believe it or not, so that people would tune in. You have to remember this was at a time when the internet was barely going public, and while you could find websites on the internet, you could not stream video or hear audio at that time. So Time Warner Cable was still quite important to us, and eventually we graduated to a different station from public access to a station called Stuff TV, which was a paid channel, and it allowed us to open some other areas of our programming to include promotions and things like that. Also, the popularity of the program began to skyrocket, obviously because there'd never been a program like Rob's Metalworks before. And really the mission of our program was to highlight heavy metal music and artists and bands in a very articulate way, in a way that represented heavy metal music as a true art form. You know, I think there is a stigma that goes along with heavy metal and the people who listen to heavy metal. And one of our objectives was to break that mold. And we did it quite well. And it became so popular that we eventually transitioned into interviewing national bands, big bands like Megadeth and Danzig and Hatebreed, and all these bands that would come in through town, and we would interview them. And over the years, I've built strong and lasting relationships with many of these artists, and also with many of the people in the industry that facilitate the publicity of these bands. And I've worked with many of these individuals, different publicists from New York and Los Angeles and New Jersey, Chicago, for over 20 years now, and it's a great thing. You know, Rob Chavez and Rob's Metalworks is a well-known name now in the industry all over the country. People know us and are happy to return to our program. And this past year, we celebrated our 25th year anniversary, in fact, this month in June. So it was a huge milestone for us, and we've done a lot of celebrating despite the pandemic, and continue to work and do great things in support of heavy music and in support of underground and regional and local acts here in Texas.
Great. I should note for the record that when I was a junior and senior in high school, I remember watching Rob's program on, I think it was Channel 20. Was that the public access channel?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a show I watched. There was another show called The Worst Show. I remember that from my high school viewing days. But anyhow, it's a pleasure to speak with you after all these years. Could you say a little bit about music that you grew up listening to, music that your parents played in the house, or maybe from siblings, other family members?
Sure. I have an older brother. I have one sibling. He's 7 years older than me. I'm 50 years old now. So I when I was like, 8 or 9 or 10, you're talking like the late 70s, early 80s maybe. And my brother, I was fortunate enough, was a rocker, and he would always be playing bands that eventually I grew up listening to, bands like Judas Priest, Blue Oyster Cult, Meatloaf, Triumph, Rush, all these bands. And of course he was influenced by this music, of course, by Joe Anthony of 99.5 KISS. So we always had Joe Anthony on the radio, or he had an 8-track in his boombox that we were jamming to. And we listened to all this stuff repetitiously throughout my childhood, and it really turned me on to heavy guitar and to screaming vocals, and I fell in love with it. Eventually, I was very happy to have the opportunity to interview some of these bands who were still doing it decades later. I interviewed Judas Priest at the Verizon Wireless Amphitheater, and I had completed a very special interview with Rick Emmett of Triumph back in 2017. And I recall telling him that I grew up listening to his music as a kid, and it was such an honor for me to interview him because his music had always played a big impact, and Triumph was always kind of one of my favorite bands from that era. So thanks to my brother Gil, I was turned on to Early's music as a kid in my household.
You said that your brother and yourself, you listened to Joe Anthony regularly. What was it like listening to Joe Anthony on the air? Unbeknownst to us at that time, we weren't quite, as children too. You have to remember, we're young kids. We weren't kind of in tune with the strategy and the vision that he had for San Antonio. We were of course listening to the band, and we loved it. And you have to think about bands like, there were bands that he played that were only famous in San Antonio. These bands went and played Dallas, or they went and played Austin. They were nowhere near gathering the respect and much less ticket sales that they were in San Antonio. And I'm talking about bands like the Scorpions, Budgie was one, obscure English band. Saxon was another. Rick Emmett from Triumph was another. I mean, all these bands that he was playing were new and fresh to us. And two of the bands I just mentioned, of course, were from across the pond. And because of that fact, we
these bands weren't readily accessible. You could barely find their music at the record stores. So it was great because he was introducing new music to us, and at the same time kind of instilling this fanhood with these bands that would last a lifetime. It's continued to last a lifetime. You have a band like Saxon, which is not a big famous band like Judas Priest, kind of like a mid-tier band, but they can still come to San Antonio and still sell out a big venue because people reminisce, and they have that nostalgia with them, saying to themselves, I grew up listening to Saxon because of Joe Anthony. And of course, Joe Anthony and some of his cohorts here in San Antonio, people like Jack Orban, promoters, other promoters, and he would work with them in bringing these bands into town. So not only was he building a fan base for these bands, but he was also facilitating business for these bands and facilitating a huge following for his program on 99.5 Kids. So all of these things were happening on the back end, unbeknownst to us. And later on, as we became older, and of course after he passed away, we got to recognize and revere the vision that he had for San Antonio. And I accredit, everything that San Antonio is with regards to our rock culture to Joe Anthony.
So, what were, you mentioned a number of different bands that Joe Anthony played on the radio, that Joe Anthony helped build up following. What about local bands that were inspired by the sound that Joe Anthony was playing on air?
Yeah, when you think about the local scene, I was a bit too young, in the mid to late 70s to go out to shows. And however, there probably wasn't really a lot of bands to go check out as far as if we're talking heavy metal music. It was probably like the late 70s where you had these musicians who were influenced by Joe Anthony and the band that he was playing, which eventually led to the formation of bands like S.A. Slayer, bands like Juggernaut, here in bands like Bifist here in San Antonio. And those guys were, of course, older than I was. They were, right at that age, late teens, who not only were fans of music, but wanted to create music and be artistic in that same vein. And many of them pursued it and did it well. And there were other bands that were influenced too, bands like Hellstar from Houston, who built a huge fan base here in San Antonio. And initially, people thought they were from San Antonio because their fan base was bigger here than it was in their own city. Same exact thing with a band called Watchtower. And you may be familiar with that name. That's the initial band of Jason McMaster, of course, who went on to fame with Dangerous Toys. But Watchtower also had close ties to San Antonio. And the reason these bands cultivated here in San Antonio, and the reason they were, even some of the bands in the outskirts of San Antonio or in other cities were attracted to San Antonio, was because our rock scene, our local underground metal scene, was strong, and they wanted a part of it. They wanted to be part of it. And I don't recall Joe Anthony ever playing local bands on air, but nonetheless, his presence in playing those bands influenced teenagers to go out and form their own bands. Nowadays, those names I just mentioned are legendary names in our scene. You talk about a band like, S.A. Slayer, who went on and are still revered, and their musicians have gone on and done great things. Dave McClain played with Michelle Machine Head and Donnie Van Stavern plays with Riot, and have done, of course, a lot of other different things. Hellstar is still kicking and alive because of the fan base that they created. And Juggernaut released a couple of great records on Metal Blade Records that will live on forever. So those initial beginnings are still relevant. They're still important. And, it's been a pleasure of mine to keep their memory alive and to share them with a lot of the young people in our town. A lot of the young 20-somethings right now who I interview on my show, who, by no fault of theirs, may not remember or know who these bands are. But yet, they're still part of that same culture. They're still part of that same cloth.
So what got you interested into the type of music journalism that you practice?
Yeah, of course, like I told you, I've been a lifelong fan, and when I became a teenager, a real teenager in 7th grade, there was this little band called Metallica that started breaking out of the scene, and I remember there was a friend of mine, and we were in 7th grade in middle school. And he says, "Rob, come to my house and let's hang out." I said, "Okay." He had an older brother who played in a metal band in San Antonio. And I never heard any of their music and I don't think they were quite popular. But I remember his brother always looked really cool. And his brother was in a band, he played guitar in a band called Wicked Impact. And the older brother walked into the bedroom where we were at, and there was a boombox there, and he said, "Guys, listen to this." And he put on Metallica Ride the Lightning, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I think that was it. After that, Metallica was instilled in my mind as a fan. And I stayed a metal fan all the way through high school. And I did my undergraduate work at Baylor University in Waco, so I moved away after high school, and I continued to be a metal fan the best I could. Metal was not very accessible or popular in Waco at that time. And I completed a marketing degree. And so when I came back to San Antonio in 1993, I got back into the metal scene, and I was going to shows. And I was going to shows at places like the Showcase Theater, the Woodlawn Theater, the Cameo Theater, and I heard about the Cameo Theater and shows that were happening all across town, the old sneakers, and going to shows and checking out bands. And one day I just had an epiphany that, I wanted to do something to help these bands, and I felt that I could because I had some knowledge and know-how about marketing. I first had to determine, what best way to do that. And while I always felt I was a great writer, I never wanted to do a fanzine or do literature. And I knew that Time Warner Cable had a public access channel. And I said, that's the way to do it. And my father had this old video camera in our hallway closet that's been sitting there for who knows how long. And one day I asked my father if I could have it. He said, "Sure, you can have it." So that camera was the initial camera that I used. And I started going out to shows and videotaping bands. That was 1996. So it took me a little while to kind of get on board with that vision that I had about supporting metal. At that time, I worked for the Express News, which is the only San Antonio newspaper. And I worked around a lot of creative guys. And one of the guys was this gentleman by the name of Sam Gaitan, who was an editor. And he sat not too far from me in our office space. And he and I became close friends. And I remember at that time I was barely learning HTML, and I had a little website. I have to remember this was before video or audio ever was on the internet. And I was telling him about my idea, and he said, "Rob, you should do it." And I said, "Yeah, but I got to come up with a good name first." And so, to make a long story short, I was throwing around some names, some heavy metal names, and he said, "Dude, you should just call it Rob's Metalworks." He goes, it's your show, right? You're going to put the bands that you like on it, right? And I said, yeah. He goes, we'll call it Rob's Metalworks. And I liked the idea, so I kept it. And after I felt that I built up a nice little video archive of local stuff, I went to Time Warner Cable. I didn't know anything about the formality of how to get a show. So I had a meeting with a gentleman, and eventually this gentleman became a huge fan of our show. His name was Clint Weir. He's no longer with Time Warner Cable. I think he's a teacher now. And he was telling me about all the formalities. Okay, Rob, tell me what you want to do with the show. And I said, look, I want to promote heavy metal. I want to talk about heavy metal. I want to videotape bands and interview bands and, you know, share them with people who don't go out to these places. And he's like, okay, that sounds great. He goes, you have to turn in, you know, 4 episodes in advance. You have to sign a contract. You can't do this. You can't do that. And you have to adhere by these rules. And you know, as long as you can do that, then you're good to go. So that's how it began. And I remember I had enough material to submit the 4 episodes that he wanted. And I didn't know much about editing, but I learned. He taught me. They had editing bays, which was really cool. You know, that was also before a time of video software, before anything was digital. So I would go into their called edit bays, and they had these 2 huge industrial VHS VCRs in there. And of course, everything was VHS at that time. So, you know, I was popping tapes in and out, and it had a little edit panel there, and I had 2 monitors, and I'd put the show together. The part that I had to kind of really buckle down was on the commentary part, and kind of introduce the show and talk about who was going to be on the show that week. And eventually I began to enjoy doing that, and I realized quickly that people who were watching the show really became attracted to the fact that they felt that they had a relationship with me, because of course the name of the program was called Rob's Metalworks, and I was Rob. So it was great to kind of subconsciously build that relationship with my viewers, and we would kind of try to find great locations to shoot different types of commentary and introductions for the program, and the show just took off from there. And when it really started taking off is when I started doing national stuff, and many of the industry people, publicists from different record labels, began to take notice of our programming. And not only that, but recognizing what we were doing and how we were doing it. And they really enjoyed it too. And that strengthened our relationship, and that gave them more of a push to give me the things that I wanted. So they were sending me all the latest videos. They were sending me all the latest releases and press releases on their bands. When a band would come into town, they would contact me and let me know. And it was a great thing once I didn't have to do a lot of the back-end legwork, because a lot of these publicists were coming to me. And it just began to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and it's never really stopped.
So you were able to find this space to, you know, continue to promote local music, new music, national acts. Why do you think this genre of music is so popular in San Antonio?
That's a great question, and I think over the decades, you know, I think there's a couple of different answers that we can kind of talk to. Initially, of course, and I'll go back and say it again, initially many of this culture, this rock and metal culture in San Antonio, began because of Joe Anthony. He started it through playing all these metal bands on the radio. And then it would allow these fans to become enamored with these bands and then go out and buy their records at the record store, or when they would come through town to go to their shows. Okay, it was a culture. and people really loved it. They loved everything about it. As the decades went by, of course, the San Antonio underground scene also began to grow because of the bands that I mentioned earlier. And those bands, like S.A. Slayer and Juggernaut and Watchtower, they influenced the younger generation of fans to go out there and love their music and also aspire to be musicians themselves. Okay? Again, and I'm not afraid to say this because I've heard it several times from many people that I've interviewed. And you have to remember, some of the people that I've interviewed on Rob's Metalworks are, in their mid-30s or their late 20s or even their early 20s. And they tell me, Rob, I grew up watching your shows. You turned me on to bands like Nevermore and Hatebreed and Iced Earth and things like that. So I feel that Rob's Metalworks has played a part in the younger generation also becoming acclimated to the culture and learning about new bands. And of course, you have to remember too, as the decades progressed, the metal scene also diversified. It wasn't just, like back in the old days, it was heavy metal. Nowadays there's metalcore and there's thrash and there's power metal, there's progressive metal, there's black metal, there's death metal. There's so many different genres now. And so while you have fans who adhere to one genre, on the other hand, you have fans and people who adhere to many genres or all genres, like I do. I love it all. And I can respect and admire all types of metal. So people grew up watching Rob's Metalworks, and then with the advent of the internet, began listening and researching these bands and listening to these bands on their own. But it's Joe Anthony, it's the underground local scene, which even today is still very, very strong in our city. We have lots of different musicians at all different levels of the game. And I get stuff all the time from local musicians. And, while they're still very young, it may not be very good, they're trying. But they're young kids, they're like 18, 19. And they want to be on Rob's. And I tell them, I said, dude, keep working. You're not ready yet. Keep working. And they do. And they do. And some of these musicians that I've interviewed, maybe who are in their early 30s right now, have been playing music in the San Antonio scene for 15 years. 15 years. And many of them have said, Rob, I knew one day I was going to be on your show. It took me 20 years to do it, but I did it. And I said, man, well, you're doing good stuff now. You're great now. And it takes time to do that. And, people still going out to shows is also a big play. It's also a big factor in why our culture has continued to stay strong. It's a variety of different things that play off of each other. Okay, that play off of each other. But Rob's Metalworks has been a part of it for the last 25 years, and I'm not at all ashamed to say that or shy to say that.
Why do you think hard rock and heavy metal is so popular amongst San Antonio's Mexican-American community?
Well, I wouldn't say, San Antonio is a predominantly, Mexican-American community. Okay. I know a lot of people who aren't Hispanic or Mexican-American who are also fans of heavy metal. I just think people kind of make a connection between the two, just because there's such a huge population of Hispanic people in San Antonio. But I'll also add to that I think that when you think about the Hispanic community, which is predominantly, lower socioeconomic, they kind of adhere to the grittier things in life. They're used to the grittier things in life. And, when you have a music that is, eloquent or talking about, all these good times, it's hard for them to relate. When you're talking about something that is heavy and really in your face and aggressive and not idealistic, I think that Hispanic people, because they are lower socioeconomic, can relate to that on a more realistic level than they can any other music. And I think it moves them. I mean, I speak, when I'm saying these things, I'm not just outright saying them because I think it. I'm thinking about myself as a young man growing up in the housing projects and becoming totally immersed in heavy metal music because I felt at that time that it was very real. It spoke to me on a very real level. I didn't want, pretty things in my music because I did not have pretty things around me. And I think a lot of Hispanic people feel the same way.
Do you recall when Joe Anthony passed away?
I do. I think I was not living in San Antonio. Do you know the year, Dr. Peek?
He passed away. Sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me. I'll just, so I'm not completely wrong. It's either 91 or 92. It's
right.
Early 90s.
Yeah, I was not in San Antonio at that time. But I remember hearing about it. And if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, he had already been off the air for a while. He had kind of I don't know what happened, but he was no longer on the air and had just kind of, I guess, in the regular public's eyes, had kind of just moved on into obscurity. And then eventually I heard that he did pass away. Again, still at that time only knowing or only understanding that, oh man, just the very surface of it, saying oh man, he was a great DJ. He introduced us to all these bands. And really that was it. At that point, I never really kind of understood the impact, the long-term impact that he had in our city until much later. I remember I was disheartened by it.
Do you recall the sort of transition there in the early 90s from, what might have been a sort of mainstream hard rock or heavy metal sound to then what became the sort of alternative and grunge movement?
Yeah, I remember that distinctly because I remember the Metallica Black album came out in 91. And that was a huge record. And I knew at that time that things were changing. And I think the heavy metal fans were ready for a change too. And I think that's why initially when you saw a band, I remember when Nirvana came out and Teen Spirit started blowing up, I was thinking to myself, this is a metal band. Before I had even seen it, if I just heard the song, I thought, well, it's heavy. There's guitar distortion. This guy is not really singing, and it's all over the place. And it's heavy, it's dirty, it's gritty. I like it. And it had a lot of the same attributes that heavy metal had. As far as, it not being idealistic and being gritty. And it wasn't until later that, people began to differentiate between hard rock music, So now, I remember when the term grunge came out, I was like, grunge? Like, I didn't really understand it. And initially I just thought, well, grunge are just the bands from Seattle. And, Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone and Alice in Chains and all these bands who did sound different. There wasn't a lot of power chords in there, but it was still heavy. And I think, a lot of heavy metal fans did cross over into what later would become known as our alternative rock. And it was pretty seamless. It wasn't a big thing that we had to kind of adapt to. Again, it was heavy, and that's all we needed, and we loved it. I mean, at least I did, and I knew a lot of my friends did, and really enjoyed it. So, I do remember that, and I remember when Nirvana, of course, led that charge, and when they blew up, and I think too, their skyrocket into mainstream media also kind of can impact a fan. Sometimes, we want our bands to kind of stay, maybe not totally underground, but, not to be mainstream. Okay, we didn't want our bands to be mainstream bands. And when Nirvana became mainstream and they were on MTV all the time and on everything that you put your eyes on, it kind of changed things a little bit. It changed things a little bit for some of us.
Do you think the city of San Antonio, its civic leaders, its entertainment industry, do you think the powers that be have done enough to commemorate, remember, and promote this legacy, this rock culture that you've described?
I don't think so. I really don't. And it's really a shame because it's been such a huge part of our history. And not only just a part of it, but a big part of it. It's kind of ironic when, how we have every year, we have our fiesta festivities for a month here. And for many years, they would bring in rock acts to headline many of the major events. And I thought, well, that's great. We're going to see Rick Emmett at, Fiesta Palooza or whatever. We're going to see, all these other rock bands play these events. But yet, when you talk about the media providing support, I don't feel that they can totally relate to it. I don't know if, personally they're not, you're talking about council people or the city manager or many of the big trustees that run the commerce of our city are, into rock music, but I'm sure that they know about or have relatives that are connected to it in some form or fashion. Every once in a while, I think the rock community gets a bone thrown to it. There used to be this music editor at the Express News. His name was Jim Beal. And Jim Beal, I love Jim Beal because he was a true music journalist. He was very objective with what he was doing, and he would throw out a lot of love to quality movers and shakers in San Antonio with regards to the rock community and write up great pieces about it. And again, our only mainstream paper in San Antonio. So whenever anyone got any publicity from the Express News, it was a big thing. Then you had the San Antonio Current, who would, every once in a while, throw out some good pieces in support of our culture. They did a piece a couple of years ago, I think, talking about, the 80s era of metal in San Antonio. And I remember that there were other younger musicians from the 90s and the 2000s who kind of felt left out. Because while the 80s may have been, the glory days of our rock culture and the beginnings of it, it has continued to grow and expand and become more diverse, like I said earlier. But they're there too, and they are just as relevant, even though they didn't start it. I wish I would see the San Antonio media and the leaders of our city promote rock in a bigger way. There's tons of different avenues for them to do that, and it's a little disheartening for that not to be the case after all this time. But I think in the long run, at the end of the day, for people like me or musicians who are out there working hard every day, it's really not the end all be all. We're still going to continue to do what we do, and we're still going to continue to love what we do. And the only reason we do it is because we have a passion for it.
Could you say a little bit about the panel discussion that you put on at the Institute of Texan Cultures back in 2019?
Yes. And first of all, let me thank you for beginning that initiative. It was a beautiful thing, and I was there when you gave your keynote speech, and I was there to see your panel as well of players in the rock radio industry. And alluding to your previous question, when I heard that this initiative was happening and through UTSA Institute of Texan Cultures, I was really taken aback, because it kind of felt to me that now the powers that be at a university are recognizing heavy metal and the culture of heavy metal in our San Antonio, of heavy metal in San Antonio. So when Greg Garrett contacted me about being part of it, I was taken aback, I was flattered, I was happy, and I knew that I could contribute tremendously to it. Just because of the work that we've done and my knowledge and history in working with many of these individuals. The panel that we put on for the event, which is coming up on its second anniversary, we did it in July of 2019. It was called The Return to the Metal Capital. And one of the things that I loved about Greg is he pretty much let me have full reign on what I wanted to do. He was like, Rob, you're going to give the keynote. And I said, okay. And that was it. That's all he said. He didn't give me any direction or anything I should talk about. He just says, you just do your thing. And I said, okay. And he goes, we're going to have a panel. You put together who you want on the panel. I said, okay. He goes, you facilitate and talk about whatever you want on the panel as well. And I was like, okay. So I wanted to put together a panel that represented, of course, we were talking about and focusing on 80s metal, and talk about and have people on the panel maybe who had not been as highlighted in previous events or previous discussions, and also people not only who had not been involved, but were also very famous, and probably because they were more famous, a little bit more reclusive as musicians. So on the panel, I had 6 people, and one of them was Donnie Van Stavern, who, of course, is probably one of the most legendary people here in San Antonio. Of course, he played with S.A. Slayer and Narita and, Riot. And sometimes he's hard to get into, in front of a public forum like that because he's always on tour with Riot somewhere. Then I had Buster Grant. Buster Grant was a singer for Wizard. He's also kind of a very obscure guy, but Wizard was one of the legends. They were kind of like the second wave of 80s bands, and were very, very popular in their heyday. Then I had someone who was very astute, Bobby Jarzombek, the drummer, Bobby Jarzombek, master drummer, who initially began his career with Juggernaut, then went on to national fame with Fate's Warning and Judas Priest, and now, believe it or not, he's the drummer for George Strait's band, which is a pretty big gig. Then I had Larry Berrigan, guitarist from Hellstar, a very legendary songwriter, still the best guitar player out there, best songwriter out there from that era. Then I had Nacho Vara from Bifist, again one of the beginning bands here in San Antonio. And then lastly, I had Al Berlanga, who was the guitar player for a band called Cyrus, and he's someone that is kind of obscure. You don't hear his name very often, and you don't see Cyrus play a lot of gigs, but they're still out and about. And brought all these people together. They were more than happy to oblige, and it was a great conversation. It was a great conversation, and I hope that that panel is on the internet, and they can watch the conversations that we had, and people were talking and reminiscing about the early days of heavy metal in San Antonio. It was beautiful.
Yes, the panel is, I believe, still on the Institute of Texan Culture's Facebook site under the video tab. So anybody listening to this, and hopefully, as we accumulate more materials for the Joe Anthony Project, we can include that video and other videos that people might donate into our archive. I guess want to just conclude here with the final question. Sort of throw it back to Joe Anthony, and this is something you've touched upon a couple times, but maybe if you could just provide a little more elaboration. Why is it important to remember Joe Anthony and his contributions to this scene?
Yeah, Joe Anthony. One of the great things about Joe Anthony is just that he's not just, when I think about Joe Anthony, I don't think people just think of him as a DJ. Like he was a rock DJ on 99.5 Kiss. He's become so much more than that now. And there are people that I've interviewed, and they know they're in San Antonio, and they bring Joe Anthony up, and they tell me, and I'll give you an example. I interviewed Judas Priest, I think it was back in 2016, and they were playing the Verizon Wireless Amphitheater. It's a very big gig. I'm backstage, and I'm sitting down with Rob Halford, KK Downey, and Glenn Tipton. And we're talking, and the first question I throw out, I say something like, "Welcome to San Antonio," and Rob Halford brings up Joe Anthony. And then I'm like, oh yeah, it was not my intention to bring up Joe Anthony or talk about Joe Anthony or talk about the 80s, but Rob Halford did, and he brought him up, and we talked about Joe Anthony probably for about 5 or 10 minutes, and all he kept saying, all I remember him saying was that he loved Joe Anthony, that Joe Anthony was a great guy, that Joe Anthony built Judas Priest in San Antonio, which of course now we know is very true, and Rob Halford knew it. And I could tell he was very grateful for it. So many of these artists, remember Joe Anthony and the contributions he made, not only to music in San Antonio, but to their careers. Who knows? Who knows what would have happened to some of these bands? Another instance of that is when I interviewed Rick Emmett from Triumph. He brought up Joe Anthony. And he even brought up Jack Warburton, and that they wanted to book him, and that that Joe Anthony would always use the Blinding Light show song on his show, and so he remembered all of these things. So when I think about Joe Anthony, and I think when a lot of people here in San Antonio think about Joe Anthony, they just think about. I think about him as someone who made an impact in people's lives. In every person's life that he touched and that he worked with, he impacted their life. And he did it through music and through the industry of music. And that's a beautiful thing. I've tried to adopt that mantra myself, because that's what life's about. And he changed people's lives. He impacted people's lives. Even if you had never met him, you still impacted your life because he brought music into your life. So I think it's vital, crucial, it's important for us to remember him for those things. And I'm glad that you had me a part of this programming to share my thoughts on him. And I still talk about him quite often with people who maybe are at least a little closer to that era. Of course, some of the younger people have long forgotten radio because radio is not as popular as it used to be or necessary as it used to be. But I feel that his legacy will continue to live on. Hopefully at least for another generation.
All right, great. Well then, anything else? Anything that you want to say? Anything that I neglected to cover that you wanted to speak on?
No, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity and asking me to be part of this. I appreciate it very much.
Yes, you're welcome. And it's my pleasure. I'm happy to speak with you. As I said, I remember your show from my days growing up there in the late 90s, and I just, felt like since I wasn't able to attend your panel, that at least, having you contribute an oral history to this project would be a really important voice. And thank you for the work that you've done to sort of carry the torch forward. So with all that, great. With all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.